What if overnight the world's most important oil choke point simply shuts? No warning, no negotiation, no ships moving, no tankers crossing, no oil flowing, just silence across the Strait of Hormuz. And that silence, it wouldn't stay in the Middle East. It would echo through New York, London, Tokyo, Delhi, Berlin, and Beijing within hours. Because if a full-scale war erupts between Iran on one side and Israel and the United States on the other, and Tehran follows through on a threat it has made for decades to close the Strait of Hormuz completely, we wouldn't just be talking about another regional conflict. We would be talking about a global economic shock that could rival or even surpass the oil crises of the 1970s. And this time, the world is far more dependent, far more interconnected, and far less prepared. To understand why, we have to start with one simple fact. Roughly one-fifth of the world's daily oil supply passes through a waterway so narrow that, at some points, it's barely 21 miles wide. Shipping lanes inside it are even tighter. On one side, Iran. On the other, Oman and the UAE. This is the Strait of Hormuz, not just a geographic feature, but the beating artery of the global energy system. Every single day, about 17 to 20 million barrels of crude oil and condensate move through this passage. Add to that huge volumes of liquefied natural gas, especially from Qatar, one of the world's top LNG exporters, Saudi Arabia's oil, UAE's oil, Kuwait's oil, Iraq's oil, Qatar's gas. All of it funnels through this one narrow gateway. Now imagine that gate locked. This is not a theoretical discussion. Iran has repeatedly stated for years that if it faces an existential war, if it feels cornered, if its survival is at stake, the Strait of Hormuz becomes a weapon, not a missile, not a drone, not a naval fleet, but geography itself. And in a full-scale war scenario with Israel and the United States, that threat becomes very real. Because Iran knows something very important. It may not be able to match the US militarily in open combat, but it can hurt the global economy in a way no missile ever could. Let's take a step back. Historically, Hormuz has been a pressure point for decades. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, we saw what was called the tanker war, when both sides targeted oil tankers in the Gulf. Even then, when the strait was not fully closed, insurance costs skyrocketed, shipping risks surged, and oil prices jumped. In more recent years, whenever tensions rise, whether it's over sanctions, nuclear negotiations, or regional conflicts, oil markets react immediately at just the mention of Hormuz. Why? Because traders, governments, and energy companies all know the same thing. If Hormuz is blocked, the world cannot replace that supply quickly. There is no backup highway. Yes, Saudi Arabia has a pipeline that runs to the Red Sea. The UAE has a pipeline bypassing Hormuz to the Gulf of Oman. But together, these alternatives can handle only a fraction of the total flow, maybe 20 to 30% at best. That still leaves more than 10 million barrels per day with nowhere to go. And that's when panic starts. Not military panic, economic panic. Oil markets are built on expectations. The moment traders realize that millions of barrels per day are trapped behind a closed strait, prices don't rise gradually. They spike violently. We're not talking about oil moving from $80 to $95. We're talking about oil potentially jumping to $150, $180, even $200 per barrel in a matter of days. And when oil does that, everything else follows. Because oil is not just about fuel for cars. It's transportation, it's aviation, it's shipping, it's agriculture, it's plastics, it's chemicals, it's electricity generation in many countries. It's the foundation of modern economic life. Now, here's where the situation becomes even more serious. The world today is already dealing with fragile supply chains, high debt, inflationary pressures, and geopolitical tensions. Economies are not in a position to absorb a sudden energy shock. In the 1970s, the oil crisis triggered stagflation, high inflation and economic stagnation at the same time. Governments struggled for years to recover. But today, the global economy is far more dependent on continuous energy flow. Global trade is larger. Manufacturing is more interconnected. Food supply chains are more sensitive to fuel prices. So, a Hormuz closure in the middle of a major war doesn't just mean expensive gasoline. It means systemic disruption. airlines grounded because jet fuel costs become unbearable, shipping costs doubling or tripling, pushing up the price of everything from electronics to food, electricity prices rising in energy importing countries, stock markets crashing as investors rush to safe assets, and governments scrambling to release strategic oil reserves, which, by the way, are designed for short-term disruptions, not a prolonged closure of the world's most important oil artery. And the scariest part? This wouldn't hit all countries equally. Some nations would feel it almost immediately and brutally. Let's look at Asia. China, India, Japan, South Korea. These are some of the largest importers of Gulf oil. A huge portion of their energy supply comes directly through Hormuz. If that flow stops, these economies face an instant energy shock. Refineries starved of crude, power plants under pressure, transportation costs surging. China, the world's manufacturing hub, would see production costs explode. India, heavily dependent on imported oil, would face inflation that hits millions of households. Japan and South Korea, with almost no domestic energy resources, would be extremely vulnerable. Then there's Europe. Already dealing with energy insecurity after cutting dependence on Russian gas, Europe now relies more heavily on Middle Eastern supplies. A Hormuz closure would be a second major energy crisis in just a few years. And then the United States. Here's where many people assume America is safe because it produces a lot of its own oil. But that's only part of the story. Oil is priced globally. Even if the U.S. pumps enough domestically, American consumers still pay global market prices. So if oil hits $180 per barrel internationally, U.S. gasoline prices surge too. Inflation returns, political pressure rises, economic recovery slows, and at the same time, the U.S. Navy would be deeply involved in trying to reopen the strait, turning this from an economic crisis into a direct military confrontation in one of the most sensitive waterways on Earth. Because make no mistake, closing Hormuz is not easy to reverse. Iran doesn't need a giant navy to do it. It can use mines, fast attack boats, anti-ship missiles from the coastline, drones, submarines in shallow waters. Even the threat of these is enough to halt commercial shipping. Insurance companies would refuse to cover tankers. Shipping companies would not risk billion-dollar vessels. So even if the U.S. Navy tries to clear the route, it's not a quick fix. It could take weeks, maybe longer. And in oil markets, even a few days of disruption is enough to create chaos. Now think about this in the middle of a full-scale war between Iran, Israel, and the United States. Missiles flying, regional bases targeted, proxy groups activating across the Middle East. In that kind of environment, Hormuz becomes more than a shipping lane. It becomes leverage. Iran's message to the world would be simple. If we burn, the global economy burns with us. This is why every time tensions rise in this region, oil traders get nervous before generals do, because they understand the economic chain reaction better than anyone. And history tells us something important. Energy shocks don't stay in the energy sector. They spread everywhere. Food prices go up because farming relies on fuel and fertilizer made from petroleum products. Transportation costs rise, affecting global trade. Central banks struggle to control inflation. Governments face public anger as living costs surge. Political instability grows in vulnerable countries. And suddenly, a war in the Middle East becomes a crisis in Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Americas, all because of one narrow waterway. But here's the critical point. Iran knows this. The United States knows this. Israel knows this. Saudi Arabia knows this. China knows this, which means in any full-scale war scenario, the Strait of Hormuz is not an afterthought. It is one of the central strategic calculations. And that's what makes this scenario so dangerous. Because once Hormuz is closed, reopening it is not just a military task. It becomes a global race against economic collapse. And as tensions rise between these players, the world is quietly watching this choke point, knowing that if things go wrong, the shockwave will not be limited to the battlefield. It will be felt in gas stations, grocery stores, stock markets, and homes across the planet. This is not just about geopolitics. This is about everyday life for billions of people, and we haven't even yet discussed which specific countries would suffer the most, how global alliances might shift under this pressure, and what the world economy might look like weeks and months after such a closure, because that's where the real story gets even deeper. So now let's go deeper, because once the Strait of Hormuz is closed, the story is no longer just about oil tankers and naval fleets. It becomes a story about power, pressure, and how the global system reacts when one of its core arteries is suddenly cut off. Behind the headlines, behind the military movements, a very different game would begin. A game played in emergency meetings, central banks, energy ministries, intelligence briefings, and closed-door diplomatic calls between world leaders. And the first question every major capital would ask is this: how long can we survive like this? Let's start with the countries that would feel the pain fastest and hardest. India. India imports more than 80% of its oil. A large portion of that comes from the Gulf through Hormuz. Within days of a closure, India would face skyrocketing import costs, pressure on its currency, and rising fuel prices for 1.4 billion people. Public transport, farming, manufacturing, everything becomes more expensive. Inflation surges, political pressure builds. China is the world's largest oil importer. Gulf oil is a critical part of its energy mix. Factories, shipping, heavy industry, all of it depends on stable energy prices. A Hormuz shutdown would hit China's manufacturing engine right in the chest. Export costs rise. Domestic energy rationing becomes possible. Economic growth slows sharply at a time when Beijing is already trying to stabilize its economy. Japan and South Korea. These countries have almost no natural energy resources. They rely heavily on Gulf oil and Qatari LNG. Their governments would be forced into emergency energy management almost immediately, releasing reserves, cutting consumption, and negotiating frantically with alternative suppliers. Europe. Already bruised from the Russian gas crisis, Europe would face a second wave of energy shock. Countries like Italy, Greece, and others relying on Middle Eastern supplies would feel the strain. Energy bills rise again, industry slows, public frustration returns. But here's the twist many people don't see coming. This crisis would not only hurt energy importers, it would also put huge pressure on energy exporters like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Iraq. Because if they cannot ship their oil, they cannot sell it. Their economies depend on continuous exports. Storage fills up quickly. Revenue drops, budgets strain, and politically, they are caught in a nightmare. They are not part of the war directly, but they are suffering massive consequences from it. And this is where the behind-the-scenes diplomacy would become intense. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and others would be pushing the United States and Iran, quietly but firmly, to de-escalate, not out of political sympathy, but economic survival. At the same time, China would be making urgent calls to Tehran, Washington, and Gulf capitals. Because China cannot afford a long-term shutdown. It has leverage with Iran. It buys Iranian oil. It has strategic ties. Beijing would suddenly become a very active diplomatic player. Russia would watch carefully, because high oil prices benefit Moscow financially, but global economic collapse hurts everyone. So Russia's position becomes complicated, quietly benefiting from price spikes while not wanting the system to fall apart. And then, inside the United States, the pressure would be enormous. Gasoline prices rising sharply, inflation returning, elections, public anger, market instability. The White House would face a double challenge: managing a war overseas while trying to prevent economic panic at home. This is where the Strait of Hormuz stops being a regional issue. It becomes a global bargaining chip. Now let's bring this down to the level of ordinary people, because for most viewers, this is the real question. How would this affect daily life? Within a week, fuel prices would rise almost everywhere. Airline tickets become more expensive. Some routes get cut. Shipping costs rise, so imported goods, electronics, clothing, food items start costing more. Farmers pay more for fuel and fertilizer. Food prices go up. Public transportation costs increase. Electricity bills rise in countries that use oil for power generation. Stock markets fall as investors fear recession. And for families already dealing with high living costs, this becomes another wave of financial pressure. You would not need to live near the Middle East to feel this. You would feel it at the gas pump, the grocery store, and your monthly bills. And the longer the closure lasts, the worse it gets, because strategic oil reserves are not endless. They are designed to buy time, weeks, not months. So the world enters a countdown to either reopening Hormuz or negotiating an end to the conflict. Now let's talk about the three realistic scenarios that could unfold from here. Scenario 1, rapid military reopening. The United States, along with allies, launches an aggressive naval operation to clear mines, neutralize Iranian coastal threats, and reopen the shipping lanes within weeks. This would be risky and dangerous. Direct clashes at sea, missile threats, possible casualties, but if successful, oil flow resumes relatively quickly. Markets stabilize, though prices remain elevated for some time. This is the fastest but most militarily dangerous path. Scenario 2, prolonged disruption, diplomatic pressure. The strait remains unsafe for weeks or even months. Oil prices remain extremely high. Global economic pressure builds rapidly. Countries like China, India, Saudi Arabia, and European powers begin pushing hard for a ceasefire. Behind the scenes, intense negotiations take place. Iran uses Hormuz as leverage. The US uses sanctions and military pressure. Eventually, a diplomatic formula emerges to de-escalate. This is economically painful, but avoids a wider naval war. Scenario 3, regional escalation and global recession. The worst case, the conflict spreads. Hezbollah, regional militias, missile exchanges, attacks on Gulf infrastructure. Hormuz stays closed for an extended period. Oil remains above $150 for months. Global markets fall into recession. Inflation surges. Political instability rises in vulnerable countries. This is the scenario policymakers fear the most, not just because of the war, but because of the economic domino effect. And this is why, even when tensions rise, all sides are extremely cautious about pushing the situation to this point. Because everyone understands the same reality. Closing the Strait of Hormuz hurts the world, but it also hurts Iran's neighbors, trading partners, and eventually Iran itself. It's a weapon of last resort, but in a full-scale existential war, last resorts become real options. So when you hear leaders talk about escalation, when you see military movements in the region, when you see oil prices reacting to headlines, this is the calculation happening in the background. Not just missiles and aircraft carriers, but tankers, pipelines, insurance markets, and central banks. Because in modern geopolitics, economic warfare can be just as powerful as military warfare. And the Strait of Hormuz sits right at the intersection of both. The world has choke points, Suez Canal, Panama Canal, Malacca Strait, but Hormuz is different because it's not just about trade. It's about the energy that powers the entire system, which brings us to the biggest question of all. In a world this dependent on a single narrow waterway, how sustainable is that dependence? And if a future conflict can bring the global economy to its knees in a matter of days, should the world be rethinking its energy security, its supply routes, and its geopolitical assumptions? Because the next crisis might not give as much warning, and the next closure might last longer. The Strait of Hormuz is a reminder that in today's interconnected world, a conflict in one region can shake the entire planet, not slowly, but almost instantly. And the real story is not whether Hormuz can be closed. The real story is what happens to the world when it is.